Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host, and today we are going to be talking about seed oils. And cocoa butter is from the cacao seed, so is cocoa butter a seed oil, and does that make it bad? Before we get into today's post, today's episode, what I want to do is I want to point out that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode, is sponsored by the members of the Chocolate Life. You can go to the homepage of the Chocolate Life. This is it right now. You have this green button in the upper right-hand corner. You can click join. There's always a free membership, but if you do have the financial resources, beginning at as little as $5 a month, you can support the work that I do here. And at the higher levels, leader champion, and guru levels, it also comes with consulting hours as a part of your membership. But again, if you have the financial resources to support the work that I do, then I do appreciate your support. But I do want to point out that there is a free membership. There's always been a free membership. And any support that you can give, including liking this video and subscribing to the Pod Save Chocolate channel on YouTube, would be greatly appreciated. And with that, let's get into today's post. This is the post for today's every episode. Every episode of Pod Save Chocolate has a post for it, and you can go click on the archives up here, and it will take you. If you click, you'll see that there are archives for episode 1 through 100, the Chocolate Life Live archive. But if you just click on archives, you'll find all of the episodes, prior episodes of Pod Save Chocolate listed here. With all that, let's get into today's episode and why we're talking about it. So the topic is seed oils bad. So what does that make cocoa butter? And why am I doing that? Because recently, let me make this a little bigger, perhaps a little easier for you to read. So recently, there has been a lot of, I have run across in my feeds, I don't know if you've run across in your feeds, but there's been a lot of social media influence, social media nutrition, quote unquote, nutrition guru content around the idea of seed oils. So soybean oil, and we're going to throw, corn is not a seed oil, but you've got canola, which is also often called rapeseed. Again, corn oil, lots of different oils, and just this generic notion that seed oils are bad for you. And the real question is, how true is this? And because although we think of them as cocoa beans, right, they're not actually beans in the botanical sense. Chocolate is made from the seeds of a fruit, right? It's a very high fat seed. And so the question becomes, if cacao seeds, cocoa beans, if cacao seeds is cocoa butter a seed oil? And if cocoa butter is a seed oil, is it bad for you? So number one, we're going to go through on a fairly technical, sciencey kind of basis. I don't often go there in these episodes, but we're going to do it here. Like, what is a fat, right? And what are the components of fats? What makes them up? What are the good parts of fats? What are the bad parts of fats? Oils are a type of fat. And just go through the entire process on a step-by-step basis to help you understand whether cocoa butter, which is a seed oil, right, should be considered bad like other oils are. And so let's get in there. All right. So first thing, number one, I want to point out here is that seed oil bad is not necessarily, I'm probably going to not necessarily, a fringe position that is built on nothing. There are legitimate concerns that are real. And the anti-seed oil movement has compelled mainstream nutrition to reckon with 40 years of dietary advice that was itself poorly supported. The wholesale condemnation of saturated fat, that sugar is better for you than fats, for example, is one aspect of this, that the promotion of margarine over butter, although this is discounted now, but for many years it was part of the mainstream discussion of fats, and the uncritical embrace of vegetable oils as heart healthy alternatives, defaults, right? So, as we know now, and we didn't know in the 1960s and the 1970s, that advice caused real harm, and the people who are pointing it out aren't wrong to point it out. So there is some basis for concern, but is the universal condemnation of seed oils, right? They're all bad no matter what, right? Is something that we need to consider. And so here, however, the leap from these specific oils consumed in highly processed forms in a diet that may already be nutritionally compromised to all seed oils, including cocoa butter, are bad, is where the evidence stops supporting the conclusion. So let's go into a basic primer. Okay, there are three types of dietary fats. There are saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and polyunsaturated fats. Fats, dietary fats, are triglycerides. So that should give you a hint. So 3 from tri, and the glyceride, which are fatty acids, which are attached to glycerol molecules. So the name tells you the structure. 3 triglycerides, right? Fatty acids attached to glycerols. So there are a bunch of different kinds of fatty acids. They include stearic, oleic, linoleic, and these are long form fatty acids, a long chain fatty acid, and lauric acid is a medium chain. These consist of carbon atoms that are with hydrogen atoms that are attached. The key difference is how many double bonds exist between the carbon atoms and whether those carbons are saturated with hydrogen. So right away, we can see that we can intuit that the structure of the triglyceride, which fatty acids are in the triglyceride, right, and their relative proportions are going to determine a whole lot of things about the kind of fat that we're eating, and that's going to be, is it, among other things, is it solid at room temperature, or is it liquid at room temperature? And then there are going to be different ways that the body metabolizes the different acids. Lauric acid, which is a medium chain triglyceride, medium chain fatty acid, excuse me, is commonly found in coconut oil. And it is one of the things that makes coconut oil unique. And at room temperature, sometimes it's solid and sometimes it's liquid. It's a chimera in some respects. But let's get to that in a little down the road. We'll talk about that. So saturated fats have no double bonds, right? Every carbon atom is bonded to as many hydrogen atoms as possible. And hydrogen's important there when we think about, in a different context, hydrogenation. What is hydrogenation? What does it mean? Right? But saturated fats, with their hydrogen atom bonds, makes the molecule straight and rigid, which is why saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature. So butter is a saturated fat. Animal fats like lard, bacon grease, beef tallow are saturated fats, and cocoa butter is a saturated fat, right? We also have things that are called monounsaturated fats, which have exactly one double bond between two carbon atoms. And the important thing here is the double bonds, right? That single kink in the chain prevents the molecules from packing tightly together. So they're typically liquid at room temperature, but may solidify, right? Think about putting olive oil in the refrigerator when they're chilled. Polyunsaturated fats have two or more of these double bonds, more kinks, even looser packing, liquid at room temperature, even when cold. Within polyunsaturated fats, the position of the first double bond defines the difference between what are called omega-3 and omega-6. Right? So it turns out that the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is a real important thing to consider. So what we have here, historically, saturated fats were long vilified as the cause of cardiovascular disease, primarily because they raise LDL cholesterol, right? the picture is now more nuanced. Different saturated fatty acids behave differently. So stearic acid, which is abundant in cocoa butter, appears largely neutral when it comes to cholesterol metabolism. By the way, the D in LDL is density, so low density lipoproteins, right? And the food, so stearic acid appears largely neutral on cholesterol metabolism, and the food matrix, what the fat is contained within, matters enormously. So coconut oil is approximately 90% saturated fat, but is predominantly proposed of medium chain as opposed to long chain triglycerides. The dominance of medium chain fatty acid is what makes coconut oil unusual. It's saturated, but it's saturated in a way that's chemically neutral and metabolically distinct from saturated fats in animal products or palm oil. So, all right, all right. MUFAs, monounsaturated fatty acids, are broadly considered beneficial. They raise HDL, the high density lipoprotein good cholesterol, while lowering LDL, and they're associated with reduced inflammation. The Mediterranean diet's health reputation rests heavily on olive oil and other foods that are a part of the diet being predominantly monounsaturated fats. But it is with polyunsaturated fats, right, which are at the center of the seed oil debate. Omega-3s are considered strongly anti-inflammatory, and cardioprotective. Okay, while omega-6 are essential, but pro-inflammatory in excess. And the modern Western diet is heavily skewed towards omega-6, which most researchers consider to be a problem. The omega-6 to omega-3 ratio matters as much as the absolute amounts that you are consuming. Obviously, the more polyunsaturated fats that you consume in general, that's not as good for you. But if what you're consuming is higher in proportion of omega-6s versus omega-3s, then that skews the balance away from being healthy. Right? So the old fat is bad consensus has largely collapsed. Today, most nutritional scientists focus on which fats, in what ratio, and from what source, not just total fat intake. Right? So, takeaway, saturated fats are predominantly animal-derived, but also come from tropical plants, including coconut oil, palm oil, and cocoa butter. Monounsaturated fats are the signature fat of the Mediterranean pantry: olive oil, avocados, almonds, hazelnuts, and high oleic sunflower or safflower oil. And this is where just demonizing seed oil in general, right? It turns out that sunflower seeds and safflower seeds are sources of oil that are high in monounsaturated fats, which sort of puts them in the same category as olive oil and avocados, right? Then polyunsaturated fats are in fatty cold water fish, high in omega-3s, flax seeds, chia seeds, and walnuts, right? Which are for omega-3s, and in most common vegetable oils, corn, soybean, sunflower, and safflower for omega-6s. So even though there are omega-6s in sunflower, safflower oils, it is the presence of oleic acid, right, which tilts the balance there, right? So the industrial prevalence of soybean and corn oil in processed food is largely responsible for the omega-6 overload in Western diets. So a disclaimer here, I'm not a doctor. This is not medical advice. If you want to take any of these ideas and make them a part of your diet, go talk to your doctor about these. But what this does suggest to me that when you're when you're shopping for oils to cook with, that what you might want to do is stay away from corn oil, stay away from soybean oil, if you want to have a neutral oil that comes from a seed source. Then something like a safflower oil or a sunflower oil may be better for you. Avocado oil maybe is going to be better for you. And you should also take a look at what the smoke point right? At what point if you just heat the oil up to, does it start smoking? It's an easy concept. The higher the smoke point, the higher temperature the oil has to get to before it starts to degrade. So that's an important consideration there, right? Another thing that we need to consider when we think about the kind of oil that we're using. And by the way, if you've got a question or a comment about any of the things that are going on here, go into the live chat on YouTube, going onto the comments in LinkedIn and Facebook, and let me know what that comment is, what your question is. I'll try to get it asked and answered during the course of the day. And I promise you we'll get to cocoa butter and what it means. Okay. So as we talk about oils in general and extracting them from seeds and nuts and the sources from which they come, or the fruit. So olive oil is extracted from the fruit, not the seeds, for example. So we're talking about oils generally. There are a bunch of steps there are a bunch of manufacturing steps. All of them, and everything goes through the first step, which is an extraction step. And then many oils go through more steps. And it turns out that the more steps that an oil goes through after being extracted, what we do is we start seeing a compromise of the nutritional integrity of the original oil. So it's always going to be better for you, for example, to consume an olive, not fresh off the tree, but after it's been fermented. All of the fats are there in their most natural state, their least processed states, and you're going to be getting all of them if you consume the olive directly. If you're going to be consuming an olive oil, then you need to be concerned with how many processing steps the oil goes through after being extracted, right, to the point in which it's put into a bottle. And I hope that makes sense. I mean, that processing steps, especially when they involve high pressure and high temperature and the addition of chemicals, are going to have a negative effect on the nutritional aspect of the oil itself, right? Irrespective of its source. So there's going to be an extraction step. Mechanical pressing, typically hydraulic or expeller, um, and hydraulic. I mean, or it could just be crushing. Again, in the case of an old style stone mill used for olives, that you can see that that's going to be a low temperature, but we're talking about industrial scale here for the most part. So mechanical pressing using either hydraulic presses or expeller presses, they generally heat. They heat through friction, and sometimes heat is added to get the temperature above a certain point, because the more fluid the fat is, the easier it is to extract from the solids that are around it. That heat begins to oxidize polyunsaturated fatty acids and to degrade heat-sensitive compounds. So industrial solvent extraction. So for example, where might you see industrial solvent extraction? You may have heard of zero fat cocoa butter. So what happens is they take the cocoa liquor, the cocoa mass, and then they're going to use a hydraulic press to extract as much of the cocoa butter from the cocoa mass as possible. And then what they're going to do is they're going to use a solvent extraction. And in this case, sometimes it's hexane, which is a pretty icky chemical, but they're going to use a solvent to extract the remaining fat to get it below a certain level, and then they're going to evaporate off the hexane. So, so extraction can be a physical, mechanical process, but it can also include solvent extraction. Obviously, the lower temperature, the gentler the extraction process is, the less compromised the nutritional component of the original material is going to be. When you've got a high pressure, high temperature mechanical extraction, which is followed by a solvent extraction, what comes out the other side is obviously going to be more nutritionally compromised. Just quick thought to note. All right. So there's another process which is called degumming. Degumming is not something that normally happens with cocoa butter, especially on a smaller scale. There again, I would have to go look at, um, because lecithin is not commonly found in cocoa, but it is in soy. So if you've got a soybean oil, it's going to go through a degumming process to extract the lecithin, which is going to affect stability. Um, and it has to do with, will the product be shelf stable? And it's not really associated with health concerns. Neutralization uses sodium hydroxide to remove free fatty acids. So free fatty acids, the higher the proportion of free fatty acid, it affects stability. And it also can contribute to a sensation of rancidity. So just this doesn't taste quite right. But it does affect the shelf life of the oil, and it can strip, or it does strip, minor compounds. For the most part, I've never really heard of using sodium hydroxide to remove free fatty acids. I've never seen that process in any factory I've visited where cocoa butter is manufactured. Bleaching treats the oil with substances which are also called flocculants. So what you can do, for example, is you might take diatomaceous earth, which is a very, very fine powder composed of diatoms, which are miniature sea creatures, which have died, and they've created a sentiment, which gets harvested or gets collected and ground into a very fine powder. And this diatomaceous earth acts as a filter mechanism, and particles just connect to it, and agglomerates are created. They're called flocculants. They create flocks of things. That's a way to think of that, although that's not I don't think that's the actual use of the term. And these will take, for example, beta carotene that might be coloring the oil. So this is a way to get rid of coloring in the cocoa butter, right, without actually going through a deodorization step. All right, so I can remove the color without necessarily removing quote unquote flavor. However, in the process of removing color, pigments, oxidation byproducts, and trace metals, they also remove tocopherols, including vitamin E, which are the oil's natural antioxidant protection system. So bleaching, and we're not using a chemical bleach. What we're doing is we're using a physical filtering mechanism to attract um, particles which are in the cocoa butter and make them settle out faster, and then make them easy to separate off. That's a good way to think about it. Um, Removing them accelerates subsequent oxidation. So it affects the long-term stability of the oil while also removing some chemicals, vitamin E, which is healthy for you. In cocoa butter, deodorization is the most damaging single step, like alkalizing cocoa powder, deodorizing cocoa butter. This is a high temperature process under vacuum. It just pulls off lots of volatile compounds, but it is the temperatures which will destroy remaining tocopherols, or significantly reduce them. Some polyunsaturated fatty acids become trans fats, and there are a lot of oxidation byproducts, including aldehydes, ketones, and other things which are generated. Right? And it's important to know that deodorization is performed on a high percentage of cocoa butter. A lot of that cocoa butter is used in pharmaceutical applications. Often deodorized cocoa butter is used on your skin, for skin products, especially when you don't want a heavy scent of cocoa. It's also used for cocoa butter that are used in suppositories and other things like that. But the idea is to get rid of all of the volatile aromatic compounds that contribute to aroma and also contribute to a sensation of taste, right? But in the process of doing that at very high heat, right, under vacuum, what we do is we strip off a lot of things and we decompose a lot of chemicals because of the high heat at extended period of times. Another processing step is hydrogenation. So this is a chemical process that adds hydrogen atoms. That makes sense to the double bonds in unsaturated fatty acid. This converts a liquid or semi-solid oil, sort of like palm oil, into harder, more solid fats. So palm oil in its natural state has a melting point of around 95, right? When I add hydrogenated, when I hydrogenate palm oil, what I do is I raise the melting point. It becomes solid at room temperature, but at a higher temperature. There are two kinds of hydrogenation, partial and full hydrogenation. As you might imagine, it's how many hydrogen atoms are stuffed into the double bonds, right? Right. Um, Partial hydrogenation also creates trans fats. Full hydrogenation, all right, drives the reaction to completion so that all the double bonds are fully saturated. So in both cases, hydrogen takes a fat that already has meaningful limitations, for example, palm oil's palmitic acid dominance, and process it in ways that create additional problems rather than solving the original ones. So let's take that in context because I think it's really important to take it in context, which is um, palm oil, with its high preponderance of palmitic acid, is is an oil that you do want to try to avoid, right? Especially if the palm oil is partially or fully hydrogenated, right? So it represents, right, a health challenge. If you have a diet which is full of processed foods or processed foods which are made from processed foods. So we'll call those ultra processed, right? So hydrogenated palm oil is by definition a processed food. If you go into the store and you purchase something, even something as simple as peanut butter, and has a hydrogenated palm oil in it, you have a ultra processed food, right? Because it's a processed food which consists of which is made with processed food ingredients. And you know, if you have a box of something, go take a look at it. Just go take a look, right? Look to see if there's hydrogenated oils of any kind, partially or fully, right? And then palm oil, right? That is a seed oil, right? That from what it is that I researched, taking a look at this, that you probably want to avoid. And it's really challenging because it's in so many things in your local grocery store. Consider that. Just read the ingredients label, look for palm oil, it, think twice, right? If there's palm oil in the ingredients, and then think really hard if there's partially or fully hydrogenated palm oil in what you're planning to buy, and you may want to not do it. All right, you may not to want to incorporate it into your diet, right? But you do want to keep track of how much you might be consuming of it, because there's sort of an upper level that is generally considered to be safe. What that upper level is depends a lot on individual biochemistry, the individuality. If you're a younger person with a lower body weight, it's one thing. If you're an older person with a higher body weight, it's another thing. If you have some other form of metabolic disease, then that complicates things, which is why you need to go talk to a doctor and nutritionist, right? But if the doctor or nutritionist says seed oil is bad, what you want to go and you say, well, doctor, isn't it the kind of seed oil that I'm consuming? And there may be better seed oils and worse seed oils, right? Let's have that nuanced discussion, right? And that's part of what it is that I'm hoping to be able to impress upon you today and give you some basic information. Right? This is not research in the sense that I'm not performing primary research. This is meta research. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nutritionist. I haven't done longitudinal studies, right? I haven't done any epidemiological work, right, directly. What I've done is I've taken a look at studies and synthesized them together. Meta research, not research. When most people tell you to do your own research, they're not actually telling you to do your own research. They're telling you to do your own meta research, which is to go look up things that other people have written, right? And base some conclusions based upon what other people have written. When you find an online nutrition influencer, one of the things that you should be very careful of is what sources are they citing. If they don't cite any sources, don't believe them, right? If they do cite some sources, go and take a look at the sources that they cite. If you can't find the sources, right, maybe they're making up sources, right? So it's really, really important that you understand the research, what you call research, and how you go about doing it, and whether or not you're doing research or meta research. I'm not doing first party research. This is meta research. A bunch of different sources, which I'm not quoting here because there are gazillions of them, a bunch of different sources here to talk about that. But, all right, I'm not making specific claims about this is healthy for you, this is not healthy for you. What I'm suggesting is that I want to go through the point by point and say, oh, seed oil's bad. Does that make cocoa butter bad because cocoa butter comes from cacao seeds, right? Does that make cocoa butter bad necessarily because it's a seed oil? Promise we'll get to there. We're going to start to do this. All right. So the cocoa butter story, right? One thing that's unusual about cocoa butter, right, is that it's roughly 1/3 stearic acid. So stearic acid is a fatty acid, right? For this reason, chocolate was lumped in with the bad saturated fats, right? Because stearic acid is a saturated fats. All saturated fats are bad. Maybe, maybe not, right? But stearic acid behaves differently from almost every other saturated fatty acid. And this is the nuance that we want to get to. This is what we want to get you, is that not all saturated fats, not all fatty acids are handled equally in the body. They are metabolized differently. And this is a point that we'll make about heavy metals. It's a point that we'll make about everything, right? That we consumed. It's not necessarily what you consume, right? That's at issue. It's how much of it you consume. And then it's how much your body metabolizes it and how it metabolizes it. What may be an unhealthy dose for one person who is, for example, perfectly healthy, does not have any underlying conditions which are confounding factors, right? So if you're a diabetic, it's one thing. If you have anemia, it's another thing, right? Whereas a person who is neither anemic nor diabetic, right, has an entirely different, may metabolize what you're consuming very, very differently. So really important to understand this. Stearic acid behaves differently from most other saturated fatty acids in the body. All right, why is that? The liver rapidly converts stearic acid into oleic acid. And earlier we heard that high oleic acids are better for you, right? The same monounsaturated fat that makes olive oil healthy. So the liver converts stearic acid into oleic acid. Cool, right? And that's not the case for other saturated fats. This conversion is efficient enough that stearic acid is essentially neutral with respect to low density lipoprotein, LDL cholesterol. Multiple control studies confirm it doesn't raise LDL the way other saturated fats do. And some research suggests it may modestly lower it. So that's stearic acid on its own, not necessarily stearic acid in a matrix as a component in a triglyceride. So that relationship of stearic acid to other fatty acids or other fatty acids is going to determine what's going on along with your bioindividuality, the way your body metabolizes things. Right? Stearic acid also appears to have relatively benign effects on inflammation, right? And this is one of the more credible reasons why dark chocolate consumed in moderation, right, doesn't produce the cardiovascular harm that its saturated fat content might predict, right? This is a case where the food matrix, it is the stearic acid in the triglyceride, the other components of the fat that is cocoa butter. And by the way, this changes from region to region, right? So the composition of the triglyceride will determine the melting point of the cocoa butter. And so if you know anything about chocolate manufacturing, you'll know that cocoa butter from different parts of the world has different melting points. Cocoa butter with a high melting point is called a hard fat, or a hard cocoa butter, and cocoa butter with a low melting point is considered to be a soft cocoa butter. And you can mix and match, and you can add cocoa butter from different regions, and then you've got a fat which has a different melting point from either of the component fats that are used to make it. It's complicated. It's like alloying um, metals. It's a chemical process called eutectics. All right, so this is a case where the food matrix, right? It is the fat and what the fat is embedded in. So it's not just the triglyceride, but what are the components of the what are the non-fat components that the fat is embedded in, right? So you could have cocoa butter, and this is just plain cocoa butter. I keep this in my kitchen because I fry in it. If try frying eggs in cocoa butter, try making popcorn in cocoa butter. It's really, really wonderful. It's a great ingredient. It's a high smoke point oil. You can use it in combination with olive oil. You can use it in combination with regular butter. It adds an aroma. It's really interesting. One of the things I like to do is when I can get my hands on, excuse me, fresh Theobroma bicolor majambo, um, patache or jaguar fruit is called, the big white beans, pan frying those beans in cocoa butter. Um, by the way, this is an undeodorized cocoa butter. Whenever I look for cocoa butter for culinary applications, smells so good. For culinary applications, I'm always going after undeodorized cocoa butter. And it's a great thing to have small amounts of it grated like this in your kitchen just for day-to-day culinary applications. So stearic acid is one of the things that contributes to the less unhealthy aspects of cocoa butter, where it is that palm oil or palmitic acid, right, right, unlike stearic acid, palmitic acid is genuinely problematic when consumed in excess. So palmitic acid is the dominant fat in palm oil, and it's also present in dairy, meat, and many processed foods, right? So why is it a problem? Palmitic acid contributes to the increase in LDL or bad cholesterol, and it appears to promote inflammation and may impair insulin sensitivity at high intake levels. Why is that a problem? Right, and I'm going to highlight this a little later. Palm oil is estimated to be an ingredient in 50% of packaged supermarket products, making palmitic acid one of the most common, most consumed fatty acids on the planet. Right? So palmitic acid increases LDL cholesterol. It raises the amount of small, dense LDL particles, which are more strongly associated with cardiovascular risk than large LDL particles, right? It also appears to promote inflammation. So it's in 50% of packaged supermarket products, and estimated, right? Making it one of the most consumed fatty acids on the planet, right? And keep in mind that this palm oil, right, may have been very highly processed. And so it may have been stripped of whatever original nutritional component it had. Now, I've been to Nigeria. They had red palm oil, which was very crudely produced in local presses, and very aromatic, very interesting color, as you might imagine. And I'm going to guess that because it was less processed, it was not as bad for me as it might be as if it was a very highly processed palm oil, especially if that palm oil was partially hydrogenated or fully hydrogenated. And in chocolate, this is important because when you replace cocoa butter with a cocoa butter equivalent or a cocoa butter replacement, it is a fractionated palm kernel oil. It's a palm kernel oil fraction. And so it's a very highly processed palm oil, which has been, um, again, processed, right? So that the melting characteristics fairly closely follow the melting characteristics of um, of cocoa butter, but it's not cocoa butter. And because it's from palm oil, it's much, much cheaper than cocoa butter. So you need to look at your chocolate bar, and you need to find out if any of the cocoa butter in your bar has been replaced by some other fat. Now, in the United States, that's illegal. You can, if you're going to call it chocolate, right? You cannot replace the cocoa butter with a non-cocoa butter fat and still call it chocolate. That's the law here in the United States. In other parts of the world, the UK and the EU, you can replace up to 5%, up to 10% of the cocoa butter with a non-cocoa butter fat. You can still label it chocolate, but in the ingredients, you need to list, oh, there's palm kernel oil or some other oil in the back on the back of this. So you need to be aware of this. In the United States, if you replace any of the cocoa butter in the chocolate part of the recipe with a non-cocoa butter fat, you can call it chocolatey. You can call it chocolate flavored. Generically, we might call this a compound, as opposed to real chocolate. But you do need to be aware that there are differences about how you can use non-cocoa butter fats in chocolate and how it's labeled around the world. But it used to be that shea butter and other fats were used to replace cocoa butter, and now that's almost entirely those alternative fats have been almost entirely replaced by some kind of very highly processed palm oil fraction. So it's really important to know. All right. So how and why the comparison between stearic acid and palm oil and palmitic acid matter, right? Nutrition research in the mid 20th century just said all saturated fats are bad. It doesn't matter what they are. Saturated fat, bad. Bad, 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 bad. Avoid saturated fats at all costs, right? So it made people wary of foods like dark chocolate and grass-fed beef, which contain meaningful amounts of stearic acid alongside other beneficial compounds. The matrix, as we said, not the matrix, but the food matrix. What the fat is embedded in, what other things go along with the fat, right? And it arguably gave palm oil a softer landing than it deserved because the saturated fat is bad narrative was so generic, it didn't distinguish which saturated fat was causing harm, right? And the chain length matters. So lauric acid, which is in coconut oil, raises both LDL and HDL, making its net effect a matter of controversy, right? Myristic acid is considered among the most potent LDL raisers of the saturated fats, and you'll find myristic acid in coconut oil. While they're all saturated, they don't all behave the same way in the body, right? So absolutely, right? So you need to ask the question, what fat am I consuming, and what is its chemical composition, right? This is to give you an idea about what that means. So, but there's one really important aspect of this conversation that struck me, and it's actually the part of the conversation that inspired me to go down this rabbit hole, which is linoleic acid is generally considered to be a relatively healthy acid, a fatty acid, but in the body, linoleic acid can be or is converted into something called arachidonic acid, and arachidonic acid is bad for you. Just arachidonic acid is widely considered to be bad for you. But what people are saying is that you should avoid seed oils because the linoleic acid in sin oils is converted to arachidonic acid in your body. And this is an oversimplification of what's going on that needs to be addressed directly. So the answer is yes, right? Linoleic acid is converted to arachidonic acid in the body. But the question is, how much? What is the conversion percentage? It's like, no, 100% of linoleic acid is not converted to arachidonic acid. What is the percentage? Okay, so studies measuring LA, linoleic acid, to AA, arachidonic acid conversion, consistently find the rate is low, typically between 0.2 and 0.6% of dietary linoleic acid intake. So if you consume 10 grams of linoleic acid, only 0.2% of that to 0.6% of that will be converted into arachidonic acid. Some estimates go as high as 1% to 2% under specific conditions, but the majority of studies are well under 1%. So what happens is the body, right, appears to have enzymes that regulate this conversion. and it will upregulate or downregulate according to specific issues, specific condition of your particular biochemistry. So it could be 2% one day, or 0.2% one day, 0.6% another day. It may depend on what else is wrapped around the linoleic acid. It's not as straightforward as you may think. So there is an enzyme responsible. It's called delta 6 desaturate. Not that I knew what that was before I did this research, but it appears that this is what the rate limiting chemical is. And it's subject to significant feedback inhibition. So the enzyme delta 6 desaturase is aware of other the chemistry of digestion and other things that are going on, and in the process of metabolizing linoleic acid, right? And when arachidonic acid levels in tissues are sufficient, the enzyme activity downregulates. And so it says, "Oops, I have enough. I'm going to stop," right? Which is pretty significant. The body has evolved to do some pretty wonderful things over the millennia. But even a small conversion percentage applied to a very high absolute intake can produce meaningful arachidonic acid accumulation over time. If you're consuming 50 to 20 grams of linoleic acid daily, which is apparently not unusual in a Western diet, even 0.5% conversion is a non-trivial amount being generated chronically. All right, so let's talk about this. And again, there is a connection of this to the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, omega-6 being bad omegas, omega-3s being good omegas, right? That's just somewhat different. Linoleic acid directly floods you with arachidonic acid is an oversimplification. We need to be really, really careful about that. So let's go into that, because here is what you need to consider, which is we have, for example, palm oil, palmitic acid. All right, we have palmitic acid, which is in the dominant fatty acid in palm oil. It's in 50% of packaged foods, 50% of processed foods. You go into a supermarket and you pick up a random something off the shelf, and there's a chance that there's palm oil in some form. And if there are other fatty acids, there are other fats, other fatty acids, linoleic acid is going to be in there, right? And right, but where, right? So if your diet consists of a lot of packaged fried foods, potato chips, for example, corn chips, for example, what you're consuming large quantities of fat, right, that have been subjected to very high temperatures and high temperature cycling for a long period of time. Is the fat replaced on an hourly basis? Is it replaced on a daily basis? Is it on a weekly basis? Has it been degraded? Does the fat contain anti-foaming agents, other things which are designed to extend its usability before it goes bad? All of those things need to be considered. But it turns out that fried foods in bags are a major contributor to to um, the the how we consume, how we might get to 15 to 20 grams of linoleic acid daily, right? It's really, really important to consider that. All right. So, right. So let's we've got a few minutes left, and I hope I haven't lost anybody with you, any of you going into this. It's a lot more sciencey and techy that I get into, but I want to give you in this last 10 minutes something to take home. So what we're talking about specifically industrial seed oils, primarily high linoleic varieties used in ultra processed food manufacturing and repeated high heat cooking, right? Represent a meaningful and underappreciated nutritional concern, primarily through the contribution to the omega-6, omega-3 imbalance and their oxidative integration under heat. So when we talk about seed oils bad, right, what you want to think about is, is what I am purchasing uh, been is it an ultra processed food, and has it been subject to repeated high heat cooking? The oil been subjected to repeated high heat cooking, right? So if it is, you may want to avoid it. And what I should probably do is I will go and ask the question. So for some common cooking oils, um, so we find corn oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, which are, which ones are high linoleic. I didn't do that, and I will go and take a look at that, right? So what you want to do is reducing your dependence, reducing your intake of these oils, particularly in their most processed forms, is reasonable dietary advice, right? So if you're, for example, if you're making a pancakes and it says put a couple of tablespoons of oil in it, does it really matter if you use corn oil or something else? Probably not, right? It's not going to have the same effect. But if what you're doing is you're deep frying, right, something in that oil, you need to think about it. All right. So that's what we want to say, right? Reducing dependence on high linoleic oils that are used in ultra processed manufacturing, right, and repeated high heat cooking. So this is where the seed oils bad is um, is beating most loudly, right? Seed oils are bad for this reason. They're not wrong, right? But reducing dependence on those oils is a very different claim from avoid all seed oils because they're bad, right? The strongest dietary takeaways from the meta research is not avoid seed oils, it's eat less ultra processed food. My definition of ultra processed food is as a processed food made with processed foods, right? So what would be? So I take a potato, I deconstruct a potato into a fine puree. I form the puree. So I've got all these processes that take the potato, subject it to all these manufacturing processes. I then form it into a particular shape and I defried that. So I process the potato and I'm frying it in a processed oil. That's an ultra processed food, right? One good example. Um, in many respects, chocolate is an processed food, right? Is it an ultra processed food? I think that depends upon what chocolate you're consuming. If this is industrially processed, which is coming off a line in tons per hour, and I'm using deodorized cocoa butter, then I would say that that's an ultra processed chocolate. If I've got something which is produced at a small scale, I'm not adding any cocoa butter, or I'm using an undeodorized cocoa butter. It's a process, but it may not be fit my definition of ultra processed. Right. So seed oils do contribute to the health risks associated with ultra processed foods. However, labeling them indiscriminately as the devil obscures the larger risks. Right. So you need to be informed. So cocoa but cocoa butter isn't healthy in the way it's often claimed about, like the way that's often claimed for olive oil. And I must admit that I've made this oversimplification saying cocoa butter is like olive oil in that it's a healthy fat. And that's true to some extent, but it's not entirely true. Right. So the evidence for olive oil, and I have to be careful about this, a low processed, minimally processed olive oil. You can go into the store and you can find olive oil, pomace, for example. I would avoid any olive oil pomace. This is made from the dregs of the dregs. There's probably solvent extraction to get the fat out of it. It's not going to be good tasting and it's not going to be good for you. All right. Many of the oils, olive oils, which are labeled smooth or things like that, are going to be blended, and they've also probably been processed. I mean, if you need to be very careful. You do want an extra virgin. I prefer unfiltered, and you want to take a look at where does the oil come from. So, for example, Italian labeling laws allow you to import olive oil from any place else in the world, and is if you blend it and put it into a bottle in Italy, you can call it Italian olive oil. So go take a look on the back of your olive oil bottle, find out where the oil came from, find out when it was pressed, right? So this is really important. What was the harvest date when it was pressed, and then what the best by date is. You also want to make sure that you're buying olive oil in green bottles to reduce the impact of light on oxidation. It also very, very important. So not all olive oils are um, well, they all come from olives. What lands on your shelf is very, very different. Minimally processed. If you're interested in the health aspect of it, this is what you want. Um, right? Is every olive oil better than every corn oil? I don't know the answer to that question. Would a pomace be better than a corn oil? Probably not. A canola oil? I don't know the answer to that question. You have to go and say, what are all the processing steps it went through um, in order to figure out what's going on. But not all fats are the same. If you're looking for flavor, duck fat, right? Just deep fry in duck fat or bacon fat. The only thing better than bacon fat is duck fat when it comes to frying, in my opinion. I like cocoa butter. I will mix cocoa butter with regular butter and olive oil if I'm looking for something. Pop your popcorn in cocoa butter. If you keep it below 375 degrees Fahrenheit, you won't have any problem with it degrading. And it's a wonderful smell. Who doesn't love the smell of undeodorized cocoa butter? It's a great thing, right? But it's important that olive oil is healthy in a way that's different from cocoa butter. So when somebody says cocoa butter is a healthy fat, the answer is it's less healthy, but it's not as healthy as, say, olive oil might be, or avocado oil might be, right? Um, the rehabilitation of cocoa butter isn't just an industry talking point, however. So cocoa butter might better be characterized as a fat that isn't harmful in the way its category label predicts, and does some things that are remarkably beneficial within that constraint. So cocoa butter is a saturated fat. It is solid at room temperature. And this is one of the primary indicator that a fat is saturated. You put it out at 20 degrees centigrade, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and it is solid, right? That's what a saturated fat is. But cocoa butter as a saturated fat is not as bad for you as other saturated fats are. And that can be in part attributed to the high preponderance or the predominance of stearic acid as the primary fatty acid component, right? That's a meaningful decision, right? And it's a straightforward result of looking at the actual molecules. So let's look at the chemical makeup. Which molecules are involved? How are they packed? What do the bonds look like? How are they connected, right? So looking at the actual chemistry of the fat and not the category label on the package, right? Stearic acid isn't palmitic acid. Oleic acid is not linoleic acid, right? And this turns out to be important. And this is why just saying this is one of the reasons why all seed oils are bad, right? Is an oversimplification, right? That you need to be aware of, right? Yes, linoleic acid is converted into arachidonic acid and that's especially challenging in particular use cases. For example, deep fried foods, right? So another way of thinking about this: oleic acid is not linoleic acid. A handful of walnuts is not a bottle of corn oil. Even or both are technically sources of polyunsaturated fats. Cocoa butter doesn't have the anti-inflammatory potency of omega-3 fatty acid. It doesn't actively promote high-density lipid, good cholesterol, the way oleic acid consumed in abundance does. It's not a therapeutic fat in the way others are for specific conditions. It has no particular benefit for insulin sensitivity beyond the neutral effect of not worsening it. It also doesn't confer the benefits when consumed in isolation, right? 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 As a fat used in heavily processed chocolate products where the flavanol content has been destroyed. And that's, again, looking at the food matrix. If you have an overprocessed cocoa butter, right, for example, a cacao product which was made from alkalized cocoa butter, or alkalized cocoa mass or cocoa powder, where the flavanol content has been destroyed, it's the matrix, it's everything. So it turns out that it is the combination of cocoa butter and the flavanols and the other things that are in a chocolate which are good for you. And the more you process it, the less of those there are. So we do need to make this balance between industrially processed chocolate and non-industrially processed chocolate. Really, really important. The health properties attributed to dark chocolate are properties of the whole food matrix, not of the extracted cocoa butter alone. It's really important to understand that chocolate as a food, right, taken in its entirety, is what contributes to well-being. And it's not just that it has these direct chemical benefits, but one thing that I've talked about quite a bit when it comes to chocolate is if I put a piece of chocolate in my mouth and it puts a smile on my face and it lowers blood pressure, right, and heart rate, and I relax, that's beneficial, right? But how do you tease out lowering blood pressure, for example, or having other effects on the body when you consume chocolate? Which of it is chemical and which of it is attitudinal? It's really, really hard to tease out, right? So what it means practically, right? In moderate amounts, consumed in moderate amounts, dark chocolate with the cocoa butter intact, undeodorized cocoa butter especially, is not the cardiovascular risk it was once portrayed to be. The dominant fatty acids are either neutral or beneficial, and it delivers them alongside flavonols and other bioactive compounds that have their own benefits, right? Meanwhile, the seed oils quietly embedded in nearly every processed food on supermarket shelves deserves considerably more scrutiny than they've historically received, right? So the TLDR, cocoa butter is metabolically neutral, it's oxidatively stable, it's structurally elegant, it's ecologically appropriate. What that means in the context of dark chocolate, right? Present along compounds that amplify and extend its benefits in ways that make the whole considerably greater than the sum of its parts. So takeaway, fat isn't the enemy. The wrong fats in the wrong ratios consumed in ultra processed foods, that's a different conversation entirely. And that's what I have to say about cocoa butter. Cocoa butter is a seed oil. Does that make cocoa butter a bad fat? The answer is categorically no, right? Cacao seeds, cocoa butter is in a category of its own as when it comes to seed oils and needs to be considered differently. And that's what I wanted to get to over the course of this entire hour, to give you some of the science, some of the chemistry you can refer to, but just generally know is that seed oils, which are high in linoleic acid, oils which are high in palmitic acid, especially those oils when they are used in processes that involve high heat and where the oil is heated to very high temperature repeatedly over long periods of time, causes them to break down. They're absorbed into the food that you're eating. Unfortunately, that means potato chips and, or at least fried potato chips, not necessarily baked potato chips, but fried potato chips, corn chips, and things like that, right? Ultra processed foods that have these fats in them, right? Not cocoa butter. So, yum, yay, that's all a good thing. And that's it for this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. I do want to again remind everybody as we head out that this is the home page of the Chocolate Life. If you haven't liked this video, you haven't subscribed to the Pod Save Chocolate YouTube channel, I'd like to get to 1,000 subscribers to the channel in the month of June, which is the 25th anniversary of my being online as a chocolate critic and an advocate for specialty chocolate. But you can go to the Chocolate Life right now. This is the homepage. You can click on the join button. There's always been a free membership since I spun up the Chocolate Life in 2008. If you do have the resources to support the work that I do financially, that starts at as little as $5 a month. And at the annual level, at the higher levels, it includes consulting time, as well as discounts on Atlas production software. Right. So if you are a annual member of the Chocolate Life and you want to get better control of your business, you can get software. There is a Pod Safe Chocolate episode I did with the developer, Scott Johnson, on this. There are special Chocolate Life member discounts available now. They will help support the channel by your becoming an annual member, and you also get significant lifetime perpetual discounts on Atlas production management software for chocolate makers. And with that, I'm done for today. I want to say thank you to everyone who has been with me at any point. Appreciate your being here. Thanks for the view. It's very, 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 very much appreciated. And I will be back on this coming Tuesday with another episode. Not entirely sure what that's going to be right at the moment. But until then, remember, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Ciao, everyone. Until the next time.